What pretty much ended up defining the Giants' 2023 season was an offensive collapse in the second half of the season. And so going into 2024, how comfortable am I with the Giants' offense? At this moment, not very comfortable.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, where it's your team every day. Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on this show, we provide episodes 3 days a week for now until pitchers and catchers report, and then back to 5 days a week for 10 months out of the year, talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, so check us out there if you have not already, and please hit that subscribe button wherever it is that you're following the show. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And where we get started is we're going to get into these mailbag questions that I've had for a couple weeks now, but nothing really has happened. And that if you kind of want an update, if you want an update on the state of the MLB offseason and where things stand and the Giants and what they need to do and who's left, we kind of got into that yesterday. And the good news is that even though you missed out on Ohtani and Yamamoto, and even though they ended up on your arch rival and that's awful and blah, 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 there's still quite a few name brand players out there, and the Giants are likely in on those guys. And so we'll see what ultimately ends up transpiring. But today I want to get to mailbag questions. So the first one comes from Generic, who says, do you feel comfortable with the offense the Giants have currently if they don't go after any other free agents? And then Mr. McBeevy says, Ben, we know the pitchers the Giants are targeting, but the batting lineup needs more than just the addition of Jung Hoo Lee. What other hitters could you see the Giants acquiring? So I'm kind of going to more so focus on the first question, which is just how comfortable am I with the current offense? And the answer is that I'm not very comfortable. And the reason being, the Giants, oh my gosh. I mean, this season, they ended up with a 93 weighted runs created plus. So that's 21st in the game. They were only better than, nine teams, right? Whatever. Okay. Yes, 9 teams. Which is not good. It means that they were 7% below average as a team. But what's crazy, again, if you look at the splits between the start of the season and like the end of June, they were one of the top like 5, 6, 7 teams in the game in this category. And then if you look from that point on, they were the worst. So we're literally talking about half the season where they were the worst team offensively in the game. And so it's hard for me to kind of look at that and then go into next year and just feel good about it unless they make some significant additions. And they did make one with Jung Hoo Lee, and I do really like the projections that we have seen so far. Like the Steamer projection system has them with a 116 weighted runs created plus, which would have been among the best on the Giants. Let me look at, we had Wilmer Flores at 136, Lamont Wade Jr. in a platoon role at 122, and then after that, Yastrzemski and Peterson around 112. So anyway, Jung Hoo Lee would have been, if that was true, if he did have a 116 weighted runs created plus, would have been the third best hitter on the Giants at bat for at bat. But the thing is, Wade does it in a platoon role, so that's less valuable than I'm assuming this projection for Lee is more of an everyday role projection. So Lee certainly does help. Getting to the second question, saying like they can't just sign Jung Hoo Lee, I totally agree, and we're going to get to more questions that are are about more specific situations. But it wasn't just last year. It wasn't like this was just a fluky outlier year. It was a continuation of something we started to see in 2022, and we've talked about this ad nauseum about like Donnie Ecker leaving for the Texas Rangers, who then, I'm not sure we've talked about it so much since they then went on to win the World Series. I did discuss how I thought Donnie Ecker probably had more of an influence on that team taking off and winning the World Series than Bruce Bochy. I don't know if that's controversial or not, but if you look at the hitting on that team, it wasn't just Corey Seager and Marcus Semien. It was like up and down the lineup, like we saw from the Giants in 2021, but also added, the Giants had some star talent with like Buster Posey, Brandon Belt, and Brandon Crawford also having huge years. But the Giants were also not very good offensively in 2022, which was the first year without Ecker, first year without Posey. And so these last 2 years combined, the Giants have been a slightly below average offensive team. They have a team batting average of .234, which is 26th in baseball over the last 2 seasons. And that's why, like, when people like Farhan Zaidi said when he was introducing Jung Hoo Lee that they view him as an absolutely perfect fit. This is a guy who's likely to hit for a high batting average. The projection I was just referring to, Steamer, has Jung Hoo Lee hitting .291, which in today's day and age is exceptionally high. I mean, the threshold of like 300 is what's good, is just like crazy. 300 is what's heard of almost. League average is down in the 240s these days. So if you're at 291, then you're really doing something. But the Giants, yes, in batting average, .234 the last 2 years combined. And their on-base percentage just .314, which is 19th in the game over the last 2 years combined. Their slugging percentage, .387, 24th. So it's almost like this offense seemingly kind of sold out for like walks and power, but 19th in on-base and 24th in slugging. So yeah, I don't feel good about it. I like the addition of Lee, but they can't stop there. And a lot of it, not necessarily a lot of it, but some of it is going to have to be like development of their own players, I think, because you've got some guys like Marco Luciano as an example, Luis Matos, and then Casey Schmidt. You've got some guys, and there's obviously more prospects, but those are some of the higher profile guys. And if you can get, above average offensive production, if not like star level offensive production from some of these guys, then that just makes a world of difference. But going into the season, I don't feel great about their offense right now. No. And especially you talk about, Jock Peterson, I know he didn't have the greatest year, but he he was like a middle of the order presence against right-handed pitching, and he's not coming back, like very likely. I would be shocked if he did come back. So yeah, they have some work to do. The subtraction of Crawford, I hate to say it, but that kind of boosts the offense potentially, but not necessarily, because you're relying right now, as it is on the depth chart, on a rookie who's unproven in Marco Luciano, who's got the upside of a top prospect and tons of power potential, but also the downside of a prospect, which is like he might totally be a bust. We just don't know. So they have work to do. But the good news, as I said yesterday, there's people out there to sign, and they've talked about trading for position players from their young pitching depth, which they do have. And so I wouldn't be shocked if they sign like a veteran, middle of the order. We discussed yesterday, Cody Bellinger, Matt Chapman. They do have their flaws, yet they also have their upside. But also trading for some hitting using their young pitching depth but they've got a lot of work to do. Anyway, coming up in just a minute, we're going to get into questions about the complicated third base situation. We've discussed Matt Chapman. There's JD Davis. There's Casey Schmidt. It's complicated. We'll get into it in just a minute. And before we do, today's episode is brought to you by our good friends over at FanDuel. Score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. And so I just pulled up the 49ers game and odds for this upcoming Sunday. They're playing the Washington Commanders in Washington, and the 49ers are at -800. That means very likely to win this game. And so all you have to do, visit fanduel.com/lockedon, place a $5 bet on the 49ers to win. And if they do, you get $150 in bonus bets. So if you've been thinking of joining FanDuel, there's just no better time to get in on the action. App is super easy to use, wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, as promised, we are going to get to more of your questions. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day, or 3 days a week for now, but every weekday 10 months out of the year, 3 days a week for 2 months out of the year. By the way, I actually have to let you know that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. All right, so getting to more of your questions, Peter says, why would the Giants even entertain the idea of signing Matt Chapman if that means blocking Casey Schmidt for 6 years or whatever it would take to sign him? He, Chapman, hits like JD and fields like Casey, should put resources toward another position. And then on the flip side, Aaron asks, it seems people are down on Chapman because the Giants have Casey Schmidt. Can you touch base on this? Just seems unfair towards Chapman. And so I just thought it was interesting. Both of you are like, people are saying, and you're both saying the opposite thing here. And so I've discussed this at length, kind of at various moments, but that's why I say it's complicated. It's to me, it really is complicated because I actually agree. I tend to agree with Peter in the sense that Matt Chapman hits like JD. Like if you look at, like, they're not necessarily the same in how they get there, but at the end of the day, like, you're going to get swing and miss, you're going to get strikeouts from both of these players. And so and you want to say, oh my gosh, JD Davis was so streaky last year, or I mean, he was really good, just like almost like a lot of guys, or pretty much everybody except Wilmer Flores. He was good for the first half and then terrible for the second half. And also what's complicated is that JD Davis had a good fielding season, especially in the first half. He stood out as just like, wow, this guy has made tremendous strides defensively. So if Matt Chapman truly like isn't much of an upgrade, if any, offensively over JD Davis, I also think like to finish that point, then he has to be way, way, way better of a defensive upgrade over JD Davis. And we're not even talking in the question, it's about Casey Schmidt. And so that's why it gets even more complicated, because I'm going to add JD Davis like into that complicated mix. So I tend to agree, but I also agree that it's like maybe the resources are better spent elsewhere, or not maybe, but like I think that they are. But then it's like, okay, outfield, but the outfield is crowded. And then it's like, my position is that they need to upgrade somewhere. And so where do you do it? And Matt Chapman, like, is potentially a guy you could actually get. Also, Casey Schmidt, like, he's not necessarily regarded in the industry as a top prospect. I think he's quite good potentially defensively, although we didn't necessarily see the best defense out of him as he moved around the field. I thought he looked good at second base, actually, and I thought he looked pretty good at third most of the time. The arm is obviously plus plus. At short, I thought he was out of position. Did not like really the way he looked at short. I mean, it is a new position for him, so that's not all that surprising. And so, yes, you do have to think about the fact that you're blocking people when you sign a player, and the Giants have been very clear about that it's on the forefront of their minds when they're making acquisitions and signing players. Is like, who are we blocking here? And are we potentially making the wrong call? And so I can see Matt Chapman, like, because this is like an idea I had just as an example. Third base, you could just kind of roll with JD Davis, and then you might say, well, I don't love that. But then what about Marco Luciano as a third base option? Because in the industry, the Giants are like keen on him sticking at shortstop, but maybe like internally they realize that maybe third base is a better position for Marco Luciano. So perhaps that trade I mentioned earlier, like, Willie Adames, or I've discussed Tommy Edman, which is more of a defense and speed profile versus like a impact bat. But nonetheless, I mean, Adames is really good defensively, and he hits for power and has had some really good offensive seasons at times. So then maybe you trade for a shortstop or something, and then third base, maybe you give Marco Luciano that first opportunity. You move JD Davis over to first base and platoon with like Lamont Wade, and DH is like Wilmer Flores, and also you deal with your crowded outfield by having Haniger and Conforto platooning a little bit, Jung Hoo Lee in center, and Slater and Yastrzemski in right. But anyway, I don't think people are down on Chapman because personally, if you're down on Matt Chapman because they have Schmidt, I think you may be overvaluing Casey Schmidt. I'm not saying Casey Schmidt is gonna be bad. Like, I'm not predicting that, but he wasn't good for long stretches offensively. And that's not shocking for a young player, but you are blocking him. That's the thing, is like third base is really the position he profiles best. But hey, if you're making a trade, and we've talked about Ha-Sung Kim, so maybe not Willie Adames, maybe Ha-Sung Kim, and the versatility that he brings, like he could be an everyday shortstop for you. And then same plan, move. And by the way, what's his name? Casey Schmidt is from San Diego, and so maybe Casey Schmidt could be part of a trade package for Ha-Sung Kim. Wouldn't be enough by himself, I don't think. But you like to. If you're gonna trade a guy, put him in a good situation, and that Casey Schmidt would be happy probably in San Diego where he's from. So anyway, I don't think, I think it's misguided. If you're down on Matt Chapman because of Casey Schmidt, then you're overvaluing Casey Schmidt. But for me, it's more about JD Davis being maybe not as dissimilar as you might think, especially when we're talking like arbitration salary we're talking what, like $6-ish million for JD Davis this year versus $100+ million commitment to a Matt Chapman. And it's confusing because the defense, JD Davis has not historically been great, but he was pretty darn good defensively this year. So is that the new norm, or did he just have like a flukishly good year and he's going to go back to being, someone who doesn't field well moving forward, in which case Matt Chapman is a big upgrade there. But then you do have Schmidt, who can really field, but hasn't proven that he can hit. So it's complicated. But I like the idea of maybe getting a shortstop, sticking with what you have, and Luciano playing short potentially, or a Ha-Sung Kim who could play third, and then Luciano could play short. But I think you would want to switch them because Ha-Seong Kim would be the better defender. To me, Ha-Seong Kim, one of the better defenders in baseball. And so was Tyro Estrada last year. And suddenly, if you've got like Kim and Estrada up the middle and Patrick Bailey at catcher and Jung Hoo Lee in center, suddenly you'd be looking at really good up the middle defense. So just trade for Ha-Seong Kim and a lot of these problems go away. But I agree, like signing Matt Chapman, there's a temptation there. He might actually want to play here. He's played for Bob Melvin. He's played in the Bay Area. Yet, is he the right player? Is he the right age? No, he's going to be 31 in year one of a deal. And do you have internal options that I don't want to say are better, but like the first, Peter said, should put resources toward another position. And I kind of tend to agree with that side of it. So the next question comes from King of Norway. Speaking of another position and putting resources into it, King of Norway says, is there a trade or free agent upgrade that would be better than the Wade/Flores platoon at first base? Could this platoon be a sneaky strength of the team? Flores and Wade overall had fine 2023 seasons. And I'll go a step beyond that and say Flores had a huge 2023 season. He was like the only guy who had a huge 2020. The only guy who didn't slump in the second half of the season was Wilmer Flores. And if you look at what he did, I mean, he ended up hitting 284, 355 on base, 509 slugging, a 136 weighted runs created plus, which is just exceptional. And he had a 14% strikeout rate doing it, which is really low. And then Wade had an 18% strikeout rate, which is well below average, but meaning better than average. 256 average, which is fine. 373 on base, which is exceptional. 417 slugging, kind of tailed off with power as the season went on. But overall, I mean, those are your two best offensive players. So for them to form a platoon at first, I think that is one spot where you don't really, again, if we're talking about where do you allocate your resources, I don't think first base is the spot. I tend to agree with King of Norway. And so I'm with you. I think that you kind of don't want to mess with that. I did discuss with Javier Reyes of Locked On Padres about the possibility of Lamont Wade being a trade candidate if the Giants were trying to get Ha-Seong Kim, because the Padres might be looking for a first baseman, because Jake Cronenworth would be able to move back to second, and then it would open up first base where Cronenworth was playing when Kim was playing second and Bogarts was at short and Machado was at third. So anyway, coming up in just a minute, more questions and answers about the KBO and AA comparisons, like Jung Hoo Lee. Was he really playing in the equivalent of AA last year in the KBO? And also the standard of national baseball reporting and the state of it, and who do we trust, and how do we know what's legit anymore with this offseason of misinformation? So we'll get into those questions and perhaps even more in just a minute. And before we do, all right, as promised, more questions and answers. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen 3 days a week for now, every weekday for 10 months out of the year. We'll be back on that format when Pitchers and Catchers Report, which always sneaks up on us in mid-February, and we're almost at the new year, and it's crazy. This has just been one of those slow off seasons. So hopefully it picks up soon. I hope and do assume that the Giants are not at all done at all. Like I've seen on Twitter and stuff, people are like, I'm afraid Jung Hoo Lee is like their only acquisition. They went hard after Shohei Ohtani, and that was after Jung Hoo Lee. They went hard after Yoshinobu Yamamoto. That was after Jung Hoo Lee. So they understand that just getting Jung Hoo Lee is not enough to appease the fans, and it's not enough to win. And ultimately not winning is going to not appease the fans. And so they understand the deal. And I think they're trying their hardest. Hasn't been good enough, but they're trying their hardest. And last year they did come to terms with Carlos Correa, and this year they did come, they officially got the guy who signed the biggest contract for a pure position player so far this offseason in Jung Hoo Lee. Anyway, the next question is from J.R. Nelson, who says, are the KBO AA comparisons legit? If so, do you think Lee can adjust to MLB? He is coming to one of the hardest parks to hit in after all. So to speak to the second part of that question first, coming to one of the hardest parks to hit in, it's actually one of the hardest parks to hit for power in, but it's not one of the hardest parks to hit in generally. There's a lot of singles out there, I think doubles and triples. Certainly triples, there's way more triples. And so overall, it plays actually kind of fair the last few years versus being... if he was like a left-handed power hitter from Korea, I would have more concerns. But he's more of a guy who's going to spray the ball all over the field, and that's not influenced by the ballpark as much as it is for a power hitter. And so I don't really worry about the ballpark being a detriment for him. But I think that some of the players who have come over and had success, like Ha-Sung Kim, come over from Korea, it helps educate front offices about the transition from the KBO to MLB and what it's like. And let's not forget, though, that Ha-Sung Kim really struggled in his first season in San Diego, but then got a lot better in his next two seasons. So he's been really good the last couple of seasons. I've seen Zips projections and Steamer two different projection systems with Lee as an above average MLB hitter. And so I do put some stock into projections when they're out there. And these projections, they're looking at historical, I don't know how much data there really is on Korean players coming to MLB because there just aren't that many of them. But the profile, we're talking about a guy who last year, 2 years in a row, had strikeout rates that were in the fives in terms of percent. Like, the dude just makes a ton of contact. He's a scrappy at bat. He also is a patient hitter. So, but anyway, the AA, I've heard AA, but I've also heard like kind of between AA and AAA. So, yeah, but if you look at the numbers, he won the MVP there in 2022, hit 349, 421 on base, 575 slugging with a strikeout rate of 5.1%. Like, that's a guy that if you saw those numbers in AA, AAA, or imagine if there was some league in between, you would be like, get this guy to the major leagues immediately. And that's what they're doing, and investing $113 million. And it's also not just the bat, it's the defense and the base running and all that, and the youth, relative youth. So anyway, I don't have the answer for you, but I lean mostly on projections. It's not like I watched a ton of Jung Hoo Lee. And so I'm going to read scouting reports, which I've read, and I'm going to lean on projections until we see him in person. And even like for Ha-Sung Kim, even in one down year doesn't even mean necessarily that you're going to struggle indefinitely. It can mean there's an adjustment period. And so there you go. And one of the things that is the biggest adjustment is velocity, because they just don't throw as hard. Nobody does anywhere. I guess in Japan they do these days, but major leaguers just consistently hitting 100 plus or around 100 these days, and that they don't really see that in Korea. So that's an adjustment. And a guy with a strikeout rate of 5%, like, I feel like that's the kind of guy who's best equipped. If you already are like a 30% strikeout guy in Korea, then I would worry about what it's going to look like when you get to facing better pitching and more velocity. So anyway, next question comes from Aiden, who says, I think the standard of national baseball reporting has been shown up badly this offseason. How can quote-unquote ordinary fans discern reliable hotel stove reporting? Obviously, you meant hot stove reporting. And so, yeah, it's unfortunate. It has been that way, and it kind of was that way last offseason too. If we look at the Arson Judge appears headed to Giants. Famous tweet, of course. Basically, I like anybody. So I guess what you're saying, like, because if you just search on Twitter or something and you search for, now there's like the For Me tab, and it's like you just see random people, and you might not know that they're random people saying sources tell me this, sources tell me that. There's basically like a handful of people I would trust. And if you're a Giants fan and you want to know who can you really trust, first of all, you can trust me. Just to say that, I'm not someone who has a lot of sources, but I'm not going to report on bad information. What's crazy is that some of the seemingly reliable reporters have been unreliable recently to an extent. But for me, Jeff Passan of ESPN is like numero uno. Just follow Jeff Passan, turn on notifications. If Passan tweets it, it's true. Ken Rosenthal, a lot of people give him a hard time. I don't really see why. I think Ken Rosenthal is one of the better reporters in the game. He's been wrong like once when he said Scherzer was going to the Dodgers or Padres, and he ended up going to the Dodgers in a trade. But I can't think of another time he like really got something wrong like that. And locally, I think Alex Pavlovich, Susan Slusser, Andrew Baggerly, those three, if they say something, it's probably true. And so Baggerly, Pavlovich, Slusser, these are just off the top of my head, Passan, and Rosenthal. Those five, just followed them. Everything else, there's other reporters who may or may not be right, and then there's just people who you haven't heard of. Just totally ignore them, because there's a ton of people these days who just are making up stuff and claiming to have sources who don't, is essentially the way I see it. Maybe some of them do at times, but you definitely wouldn't be able to tell. And these other reporters, they know, and they do have sources. So keep the circle small, and just, if you hear it from anybody else, it's probably not true. Or at least it's very possibly not true. Anyway, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. Everydayers, more mailbag questions tomorrow. Unless anything happens with the Giants, we'll be there to cover it. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on X at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. Helps me out a lot, so thanks in advance. And thank you to everyone who's done so already. Can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.